the worldview that is most opposed to the Texan worldview, see Texas as their main opponent from enacting their will basically on the rest of the country, which makes for a very interesting state of affairs right now, especially with the fact that New York and California are bleeding out population-wise, and Texas is growing like gangbusters. And that all comes to a head in the abortion debate. That the abortion debate epitomizes every other aspect of these two ways of life.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm your host, Peter, and I have with me...
Hey, I'm JP.
Yep, my brother, JP. So welcome. We're really glad that you're here. We are filmmakers and storytellers, and we're Catholics. And so we are working to revitalize the world of Catholic art. Today, we're talking about Texas, our homeland. And this is the Texas episode, so I'm super excited. Welcome. So we're going to be talking about what makes Texas unique and why it's different from the other states, and then hopefully kind of delve into some of its history and then maybe make some predictions for its future. Does that sound all right to you, JP?
Sounds great. I'm excited to talk about Texas.
Texas. So obviously, if you're not from Texas, you know that all Texans speak about Texas and won't shut up about it, which is a good marketing strategy, but hopefully it won't backfire by making a whole bunch of non-Texans come and mess everything up. But we'll get into that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Speaking of marketing, it's interesting because if you travel to another country, I remember when I first started, as a college age student traveling around the world a little bit, and I started off by saying I'm from the United States, and people would be like, "Oh." It was not a very popular thing to say most of the time. And I switched to saying, "Oh, I'm from Texas." And the smile that people would light up with their face, they would be like, "Ah, Texas." And then invariably they'd go, So yeah, I mean, somehow Texas is way better marketing than the United States on the global scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of like even in Asgard they know about Texas. So I remember one of the Thor movies. He was like, "I got these, and I call this one Texas." Put them together. He had like two AR-15s in each hand.
I remember that. I remember that. That was a good character.
Midgard called Texas.
That was a good character.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So obviously we like to talk about ourselves, and I think there is a reason for that. I don't know. I don't think that it's all just swagger. I think that we actually have some substance to back this up. But I think the reason for that is kind of like about our identity right now, but also about like how we started out, how we became a state in the first place, because we do have a pretty unique history as far as states go. I don't know how familiar the general population is with it. I honestly don't even know like what they teach these days.
I'm going to assume nothing.
Okay.
Of value.
So sad.
Well, walk us through a little bit, Pete. I know a little bit about the Texas history, but why don't you fill people in with the Cliff Notes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Cliff Notes, Texas did have its own war for independence, and we have our own set of founding fathers and revolutionary heroes like Davy Crockett and Austin and Travis, and of course Sam Houston, who the city of Houston is named after. So we have this set of heroes as well, which kind of does lay out a similar, I guess, legendary origin story same as the United States with George Washington and all those people. So Texas is super blessed because we have the founding fathers of the United States, who we love, and then also the founding fathers of Texas, who we also love. So we're got double the amount of legends to look up to.
Can you set the stage a little bit for,
Mm-hmm.
So who are we getting independent from? obviously
Okay.
not from England. And who were these legends fight, where were they fighting, who were they fighting, all that good stuff.
Yeah, of course. So this is we're talking about the early 1800s, getting into the mid 1800s, so 1830s. Texas is under Mexico at this time. It's actually it's a joint state, so this massive territory called Colilla y Texas, y Tejas. So it's this just huge territory, the most northern territory of Mexico. At this time, Mexico, similar to as it is now, is just completely disorganized.
Well, I love the misnomer. Like it was marketing to name Texas Tejas because I think it means friendly. It's something nice, Texas. And really what the state of it was a bunch of bloodthirsty bands of Indians that were roaming the prairies that were just incredibly fierce, so good at killing people that people were terrified. The Mexican, non-native, of that region did not want to go and try and colonize this area because it was so intense. And you had mostly a bunch of Franciscans who were brave or foolhardy enough to go there and speak to these Indians around the San Antonio area. And it's fascinating, the history of the Franciscan missions in this area, because they were the only ones that were foolhardy enough to be there for a long, long time, for hundreds of years. And the Indians that were less warlike, less, maybe let's say less good at killing people, were flocking to these missions because there was protection there. There was protection from the other bands of roaming, warring Indians behind the mission walls. So it was a fascinating time prior to the Texas War for Independence.
That's true. And what you're just talking about, that heritage was actually, I'm sure this is the case for you as well, but for me that was very formative. That's a big reality for me, because as a kid, 3, 4, 5, to 7, our parish, our church that we would go to was a mission, and it was one of the most preserved missions, I think, Mission San Jose in San Antonio. They had the massive walls still around the whole property. And at the gates, you would see the holes that they would stick their rifles through to defend themselves from the native, the aggressive Native Americans. And so,
and there were a couple of Spanish soldiers. I mean, you look at the records, the mission records. There was maybe 1 or 2 Spanish soldiers who trained the Indians that wanted to be there. If they wanted to leave, they left. It's really simple. And because there had no way of forcing Indians to stay if you only have 1 or 2 soldiers and then 5 peaceful Franciscans. The Franciscans are not the types that can force someone to stay against their will. And so it was the Indians who were manning those rifle holes, because they were the ones who would get killed along with the Franciscans and Spaniards, the couple of Spanish soldiers, if those they're so good at there's a Apache Comanche type of people. If they managed to get in, everyone was dead, especially the Indians that were there.
Yeah. And I think that, I guess as a side note, we'll get to the point sooner or later, but as a side note, people I think there's especially in Mexico, there's this huge misunderstanding of the pre-Columbian world, of that the Native Americans were living in peaceful harmony and everything was a utopia. And that is definitely not the case. These tribes and these different nations were warring against each other constantly. And it was very much might is right. The European civilization was gentle in comparison to what was going on in America pre-Columbian. So it's the completely might is right in that the strongest just took advantage and enslaved the weak. And that's just how it happened. In some ways they did there's things that we can learn from the pre-Columbian Native Americans, their harmony with oftentimes the way that they lived off the land is really interesting. But I don't think I would want to live in that kind of
No.
world that they lived in. Because
Well, neither did they. That's why they went to the missions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but yeah, also what I was saying is it's just I grew up with surrounded by this kind of imagery, the missions, and it just really was very formative, I think, to my imagination and to like the way that I want to tell stories, because this was a reality. This heritage and this history was a reality to me, which just I used to play around like I was one of the Indians, like defending the mission. I used to like stand there at the gate and want to defend the mission. It was super like.
I remember that. Pete was a really cute little kid, guys. He always had his cowboy boots, and he generally had a little toy rifle with him as he marched around with his Davy Crockett buckskin shirt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the old coonskin hat.
Oh yeah, the coonskin hat. That's right.
Yeah, Davy Crockett was definitely my biggest hero as a kid. So what were we talking about? We were talking about how we let the beginning of Texas.
Right. So it's sparsely populated. And take us from that. Mexico has that, you said the Texas Coahuila or something like that. And so we have that sparsely populated state. How does it go from that to a Texas war for independence?
Right. So there is a political leader in Mexico that arises during this time, Santa Anna, and he was elected president, but after a certain point of his presidency, he declared himself dictator of Mexico.
As dictators always do.
As dictators do. And the people did not like that. There was widespread rebellion across Mexico, like many different states. Texas was not the only one to rebel. Zacatecas rebelled. All these different states are rebelling. The advantage that Texas had, Texas also rebelled because they didn't want to be underneath this dictatorship. At the beginning of the Texas Revolution, the rallying cry was the Constitution of, I forget what year it was exactly, but it was 1830 something, that they were saying like, hey, we signed this Constitution and we want the rights that came from this Constitution. We don't want to be under this dictatorship of Santa Anna.
Yeah, but who's there, Pete? Like who the people are there? I mean, we've painted a picture where it's really just the missions. Mm-hmm. Who is there that's rebelling? Because obviously it's not the Franciscans' purview.
Yeah, we have a combination of Tejanos, which are Mexican citizens who are living in Texas, the northernmost region. So at this point, more of those had come in to Texas. And then we also have a very large amount of expat Americans who many of them they were kind of the frontiersmen. They were getting a little cramped in the United States.
Right.
And they came out here to Texas kind of just as immigrants and as pioneers.
Well, it was a marketing strategy on Mexico's part. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a desire to colonize this wild, untamed land, and there was on the Mexican government's part, but there was not much desire because people didn't really feel like dying on Mexican nationals' part. People that are living in more southern central Mexico, and so they realized there's all these crazy Americans. I mean, America still has, obviously, but had especially then this idea this persona to be up for anything sort of thing, like wild type of tamers of the untamed of the wild land, those pioneer type of mentality. Mm-hmm. So the word got out that if you want to go to some wild, untamed land and experience, that excitement of doing that, of fighting out in this a peace for yourself in this wild prairie, come to Texas, because that's the place for you. And so you see a lot of young men at the time were just leaving. They would leave America, leave wherever they were at. They would put GTT on their door, gone to Texas. And they were coming to Texas. All these Americans were coming to Texas. And there was a pretty good amount of them at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is the point, I guess. Also, Santa Ana is getting more worried
Yes.
because so many Americans are
They were
coming
too
in.
successful. Mm-hmm.
Right. Like they're like realizing they're creating a little bit of a monster here because there's so many Americans here now that they're starting to get worried about their retaining control over Texas.
Right. Because Americans are going to be more loyal to America than to Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting though, because when you get Austin, who is considered the father of Texas,
Stephen F. Austin.
Stephen S. Austin, yes. He was very much like of the mindset that like, no, I'm becoming a Mexican now, because he like became fluent in Spanish. He actually even legally changed his name to Esteban, and he became like the representative of Texas to the Mexican government. But there was a certain point when he was he went to Mexico City and he was negotiating for the rights of the Texans, and he was imprisoned by Santa Ana for trying to negotiate for the rights of Texans. And at a certain point in prison, I think is where he had that mindset change. He was like, yeah, this is not going to work. We're going to have to be our own thing. And so at a certain point, actually, this is really interesting that we're talking about this because I'm actually holding a Texas coffee mug where it says "Where Texas Became Texas," because I got this at Washington on the Brazos, which is where the delegates from across Texas, Tejanos and American Texans, met together and they wrote out the Declaration of Independence for Texas. And yes, Texas does have its own Declaration of Independence.
That's right. That's right. So you spoke about how they wanted to honor the Constitution of 1836. These delegates gathered and said, we're declaring independence because Santa Ana has changed the Constitution against our will, and we agreed to this Constitution of 1836. Did I say that accurately?
It's not the Constitution of 1836, but everything else you said is correct, yes.
Okay, Constitution of which, do you know?
I forget the exact year. I think it might be 1830.
Okay,
it wasn't that
so
old.
It's a prior constitution. What exactly changed, and what were they unhappy about? Do you happen to know?
Well, there's many things they were unhappy about. I think that the Mexican government, like you were saying, like they're becoming very nervous about this influx of Americans coming into Texas. So they're trying to tighten their grip and basically just making it harder for the Americans to live there. Another thing, of course, is that Santa Ana becomes a dictator, and he basically just throws out the Constitution. So it's like if the Constitution of the United States were to be thrown out, I think that we as modern day Texans would be extremely upset. Like I think that would cause rebellion immediately because without the Constitution, you have nothing guaranteeing anything,
So there was no Constitution at that point?
I think, no, there wasn't a Constitution. He might have written out a charter of his own, but like he had the right to amend anything. He had the right to make any changes, and he had ultimate power. He is, an autocrat. And so there's many discussions even at Washington on the Brazos where they're writing out the Declaration of Independence of whether they should what their goal is. Like at first they didn't really want to become their own nation. They were like, we want to just fight for our rights. But at a certain point, it just became apparent that Mexico under Santa Ana was not going to honor any kinds of rights. And it was just necessary in order to guarantee their way of life to become their own nation. So of course, once that happens, Santa Ana musters a force. He drafts a whole bunch of soldiers, which makes Mexico even more mad because they're drafting a whole bunch of soldiers to go off into this frontier Texas and die. And so Mexico did not like that. But he musters a large force, goes to Texas to crush the rebellion.
Yeah, I remember he calls himself at this point the Napoleon of the West. The head of his force.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and so he goes to Texas and he commits a lot of massacres on on different towns in Texas. We have like
living up to his name.
Yeah, going through. If you drive through the countryside in Texas, you'll see like there's different markers that we have. Like here, this is where the massacre of Goliad happened, and Santana came and just killed everybody, and so that's not great. And then of course the massacre, the most famous massacre probably in all of America, is the Alamo, where
remember the Alamo.
Where my hero, Davy Crockett, came down. And Davy Crockett has a very fascinating story as well, where he is standing up for the rights of Native Americans in the U.S. Congress, and
facing down the president at the time,
right.
Andrew Jackson.
And for that, he loses his political career, and he's basically ostracized from society. And so he's like, well, I don't need this anymore. I'm going to go to Texas.
Yeah, people are probably familiar with the Trail of Tears, where it was a grave injustice that the United States committed against the Native American tribes at the time, and led to many, many, many of their deaths. We could go into more detail at another time, but Davy Crockett basically committed political suicide trying to stop the Trail of Tears from happening. Because although he was a famed Indian fighter, he also saw these people as people, and he wanted to honor the agreements that we had made with these people. And so he found that Jackson was willing to basically commit a grave injustice, and even though he was president, Davy Crockett went up against him, and he lost, and he realized Washington had no place for him, and so he left around the time the Trail of Tears got started.
Yeah. So it's this. I think this is also this idea that Davy Crockett has here is like very formative for what we're talking about here, and what makes Texas unique, because his idea was that he didn't want to be a part of this basically genocide, of throwing the Native Americans out of their lands and going, reneging on all of their treaties with them. And so he wants to separate himself from that, but he sees that this group of Texans is fighting for their freedom. It's fighting for their rights. Like sees this as the idea of standing up for liberty. And so he is like, all right, I'm going to go be a part of that. And he very promptly is killed for that. He goes to the Alamo, and there at the Battle of the Alamo, the Texans make a very, I would say, heroic last stand in San Antonio. And they are like vastly, vastly outnumbered. I forget the exact numbers, but it was thousands to hundreds. The Texans had hundreds holed up in the Alamo, and Santa Anna had thousands. Yeah. And so obviously we all know how that ended.
The Alamo was under command of Bowie at this time, James Bowie, who was also a famed fighter, or a famed frontiersman, but he was very sick. He was close to death already. And so real command was under William Travis, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah.
I should have read up a little bit more again on this.
And prepare for this podcast? Sorry, folks. Sorry. So Travis was he was a bit of a hothead by all accounts. What do you think of that, though? Have you found that to be the case in your studies?
I mean, I think a lot of them were, because they're like brave frontiersmen, and so they just like, if they decided to do something, they would go and do it. Like, Davy Crockett's the same way.
Well, it takes a special personality to be able to accomplish all the things that these people accomplished. So,
oh my gosh, if you just look at Sam Houston,
that's one of my heroes, Sam Houston.
Sam Houston is like the things that this man accomplished, and while making time for like having multiple identity crises. Like, I don't think anyone has accomplished more and been more insecure about his identity at the same time. Like this guy is just, I guess, a natural leader. because
Yeah.
he somehow managed to become a leader in 3 different nations within his lifespan.
Walk us through that and take us to where he ends up.
Yeah, so Sam Houston, first, I think he was in Congress in the United States. He's from Tennessee, just like Davy Crockett.
And even before then, wasn't he raised by Indians?
So yeah, he has like an interesting history. I don't know if he was raised by Indians, but he definitely grew up very much in that kind of world. It was like,
Well, I believe he had a Native American name and a Native American family.
Mm-hmm.
Like
I think
he was a part of
later, though.
He was officially a part of a tribe, though.
Yes, that came. So he was in Congress, and he was also governor of Tennessee. At a certain point, I think it was that his wife, he had like a divorce with his wife, and he was very heartbroken. So he basically left and went to live, gave up his career and went to live with the Native Americans. And there he was accepted as one of them, and he was given the Native American name and everything. And he then became a representative to the United States from that tribe. And so he like just has this natural tendency. It seems like he almost unwillingly just ends up becoming a leader wherever he goes. But after a while, he then makes his way down to Texas, where all of this revolution and fight for freedom is happening. And he very quickly becomes involved in that, and is very soon at the meeting at the Washington Brazos, where they declared the Texas independence. They also appointed Sam Houston to be the leader of the military. And so Sam Houston is leading Texas's forces, which are vastly outnumbered. And
against the Napoleon of the West.
Mm-hmm. And basically he's leading after the Alamo. He's leading what's left of the Texan forces, and Santa Anna is chasing him throughout East Texas. He's just Southeast Texas. So it's basically a forced march where Santa Anna is just plowing through Texas, burning down towns everywhere he goes, and the Texan forces are on the retreat. There's a critical juncture where Sam Houston is faced with this decision. Like, he can continue retreating and try to just survive in Texas, or he can there's like a fork in the road basically, where he can try to make it across the Texas border over to the United States, where he can try to seek asylum. Of course, he decides to stay in Texas and continue fighting with these forces. And it's in Houston, what's today Houston, that where they make a really interesting move, where the Mexican forces are encamped along the bayou. In Houston, we have lots of bayous, but they're encamped along the bayou at San Jacinto, and they're sleeping, having their siesta, and Houston decides to make a surprise attack. And it's there he just absolutely decimates Santa Anna's forces, because they're completely taken by surprise. Here, the Texan forces had been retreating for months now, and they weren't expecting any kind of offensive at all. So they're completely unprepared, very disorganized, and the Texan forces very quickly rout them and end up capturing Santa Anna. And so it's there that they, instead of killing him, they negotiate a peace treaty with him, saying that you have to recognize Texas independence in order to go back to Mexico. And so he has nothing to bargain with, so he does agree, and they let him go, which is interesting, because they honored their agreements. And but Santa Anna does not. As soon as he gets back to Mexico and takes his dictatorship, he refuses to acknowledge Texas's independence and is pressuring them the whole time, claiming that Texas is still part of Mexico. Anyway, long story short, Texas does get its independence after a lot of sacrifice on the Texans and Tejanos' parts, and Texas remains a nation for 10 years. from 1836 to, really, they officially became a nation in 1836, but they declared independence in 1835. And then in 1845, they have a citizen vote throughout Texas on whether they should join the United States or not. And it's very difficult to start a new nation, and there was a lot of problems as far as like the currency, like we have today with inflation.
What? Currency problems? Never heard of it.
And so, like, in the interest of basically retaining their way of life and wanting to continue retaining their identity, they're like, we can best do this by voting to become part of the United States. And so the United States accepts it eventually. And in 1845, Texas becomes a state. And so
we made a few provisions, though, in that agreement. There's a few things that are particular about Texas. What were the ones, Peter? I remember, you know them better than I do. When we made this agreement, we had a few caveats, didn't we? That no other states have.
Right. I mean, we did write into that we had the right to leave. Should we decide that we no longer want to be part of the Union, we had the right to leave. This is something that I doubt that the federal government would ever honor. So I think if Texas ever did want to leave, we would have a pretty big fight on our hands. But we retained very much in that vote that we are our own thing. We're different because of our heritage and our, like, where we come from. Like, we don't want to lose that identity. So in many ways, Texans kind of thought of themselves as Texans before being Americans.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is this idea that existed then, and you still see the remnants of it now, that Tejano idea, that there's more of a mixture between Americans and Native Americans and Mexicans, and they all come to Texas, and there's an idea of Tejanos instead of just Americans, or instead of other, instead of part of a nation that's larger than Texas itself. There's an idea that existed then. No, we're Texans, we're Tejanos, we're something that's specifically different from these other two nations. And you see that definitely now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that is kind of like what you're saying, like what you see it today. Texas now, obviously things have changed, things have evolved over the centuries. I guess it's a couple of centuries now. And so, but I think that identity still remains in much more real way than United States. I think United States has kind of lost a lot of its identity from its founding.
That identity also, just to add, some people might say, well, it's just a Southern identity because you were part of the Confederacy. And I do not find a Southern identity all bad. I think there's many problems with Southern identity. So I'm not trying to say that is a bad thing by correcting that's this statement as I'm about to correct it. But when the Texas delegates were voting to join the Confederacy or not, there was Sam Houston, who was the governor at that time, who was just all out against it and did everything he could and abstained from every vote that he could to stop Texas from joining the Confederacy, because he saw that as a disaster of being part of the Confederacy. And there were many others like him. Now, there weren't enough leaders, unfortunately, to block that from happening. But that sentiment that we are not part of this Confederate state existed quite a bit in many people at the time. So I use that as a marker of showing, like, okay, well, it's not just that it's not just some Southern identity. It's something very distinct from the entire Southern identity. Not that I'm saying that that's bad, the Southern identity as a whole. There's many problems with it, especially historically. But there is something distinct about Texas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that there's an interesting question, like moving into the future. How do we, like, what does that identity mean to us, and how do we like retain it going into the modern age? Like what parts are good, and what parts need to be is most important to retain like during this time, because there's a lot happening right now in the United States, I think, and there's a lot of change. Like I think I've said it before on this podcast that like things happened in 2020 that I never ever thought I would ever see in my lifetime. So it's a crazy time to be alive. And I think that being in Texas is probably not to scare anyone who's not in Texas, but I think Texas is one of the best places to be right now to kind of weather this storm that's undergoing. So there's a lot to unpack there. But I guess, how do you see, and JP, like, how do you see Texas's identity preserved, and like what we have today, and like where do you see any like dangers that Texas is facing, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the most interesting thing to Texas identity, and I see that we only have a few minutes left, and this is definitely not a few minutes type of conversation. Maybe we wrap up a little bit about where we see the dangers are, and we can continue this next week, you think?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So I find something fascinating right now where we're at on the abortion debate. Obviously, this is getting Google is now, no one will see this podcast, but still, I think it's worth talking about. Texas was the first of the states to enact a heartbeat law, successfully enact a heartbeat law, where a baby in the womb will be allowed to live past, I think it was 15 weeks. You know this better. What is this heartbeat law that's happening?
Yeah, the Texas Heartbeat Act, the law is that once a fetal heartbeat is detectable, the baby's heartbeat is detectable, the abortion is not supposed to be committed. And so that, by most technology, most commonly used technology, is at 6 weeks. So this is by far the earliest that any state has not allowed abortions, because other states have like 20 weeks, 22 weeks. The earliest most states have is 15 weeks, but Texas does have 6 weeks as the marker.
Right. Okay. So why do I bring this up? Because other states think of Texas as, well, let's say other states, the whole California contingent, the California, New York contingent, which are the leaders basically of, I would say, the worldview that is most opposed to the Texan worldview, see Texas as the leader in, I think justifiably so, the leader, their main opponent, the main amount of centralization of power that can block New York and California from enacting their will basically on the rest of the country, which makes for a very interesting state of affairs right now, especially with the fact that New York and California are bleeding out population-wise, and Texas is growing like gangbusters. And that all comes to a head in the abortion debate. That the abortion debate epitomizes every other aspect of these two ways of life. That you see on one side the Texan, more conservative, more religious aspect of life, and the New York and California side, which is the more far left way of life. And it all comes to a head really in the abortion debate, and justifiably so. Living in California, the one thing I would hear the most about when they talked about Texas was not gun rights. It was specifically abortion. They would be upset about Texas for the stance, the views that we had on abortion. And the fact that we here in Texas were the front runners for this abortion, this Abortion Rights Act, this shows exactly that us as voters, us as a voting people that votes upon principles and beliefs, is justifiably leading the charge for this different way of life as opposed to the New York and California way of life. And I see that as the real dividing factor between the two sides of the debate. And whether or not the country follows the Texas way of life or the California, New York way of life will dictate, I think, how our beliefs come, like what happens to our identity or not. Will Texas hold that identity, that sort of sanctity of life identity that we have now? Will the country follow Texas, or will the country follow California, New York? Where that I see that as kind of the major state of affairs right now. What is your take on that?
Well, we are on the brink of some major conflict. I don't know if I would say like a civil war, but we do have these radically different ideas and visions of the nation. It's becoming more and more apparent, especially with like things like COVID restrictions and mandates. I'm not going to say the word.
Yeah.
But you have California and California and Texas are different nations right now. It's just different ways of life. And there are many people in Texas who want us to become more like California. And so I do think that we're at a crossroads, or at a juncture right now, where we do have to decide like what we're going to value. And I think the decisions that we make in the next few years will kind of, I guess, dictate our future for a long while to come. Because we can decide to go the way of California or New York, or we can continue to be the leaders of the more rooted, I would say rooted more like values, more value rooted as far as like family and
I would
life.
I would say more inclusive. Texas always has had a more inclusive outlook. That whole combination that I spoke about, where the Franciscans really instilled that, where it's not we're these Europeans and we're different from you. It's we're a part of your tribe now. We live like Sam Houston was the same way. No. I am a part of this tribe. We're together, and now together you and I are a new thing than what I was before or what you were before. There's a much more inclusive mentality inside Texas as opposed to what you see in California or New York. Especially right now, California used to have a more inclusive mentality, but here we're seeing, oh no, this is not just that this was me. This is just me. This is me and another person in this equation that we need to think about. It's a much more inclusive mentality.
And that's I know like we're out of time, but that I guess moving into our discussion next week, that's a very really interesting point to make, because oftentimes I think that when people portray like conservative values or just like family values or more Christian kind of values, it's seen as a very like white, like evangelical kind of idea. But Texas is definitely not that. I don't know, maybe different parts of the South might be, but Texas is extremely different from that, because Texas is actually extremely diverse. And like you were saying, has always kind of been very diverse. Because you had that influx of immigrants from many different nations besides the United States. And Houston itself is, if not one of the most diverse cities in the United States. And even with that diversity, we're also still very conservative and very values-based. So those two are in no way incompatible. So... Go ahead.
I'd love to talk more about this next week, but I think what we should start out next week is showing how the left has completely ceded the idea of inclusivity. What we have here in Texas is an idea that you do not have to believe exactly what I believe in order to be allowed in polite society. There's ability for diverse landscape of thought and dialogue, at least within the Texas community. or Texan community. In the left of us in California, which we can speak to firsthand, if you disagree, you're no longer allowed within the society that they're building. You're cast out completely. So, I mean, YouTube is a perfect example of that. The fact that we're talking about these issues means that very few people are going to watch this podcast. And so what we're going to see, I think what we'll be exploring next week is a little bit is, what does that mean? The fact that we have open dialogue still in Texas. What does that mean for the artistic environment? What does that mean for our future? Where are we headed? Will we be able to maintain that? And then on the other side, where is the Californian type of mentality headed? I think those are at least a few of the questions now.
And it's a fascinating topic to discuss. I'm looking forward to it. But that idea of, I think art thrives on freedom. And so what does it mean as Texans and as artists? And that juxtaposing to that to what we've seen other places, which have traditionally been known for art. But I think that's kind of being quashed now. So I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Me too.
Yes, sir. But in the meantime, I hope y'all have a great week. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, this has been the Pinedo Brothers.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.